Hey everyone, I'm Sandy Lucas, the Program Manager for the Climate Variability and the Predictability Program at NOAA. Thank you for joining us for this webinar series called Years of Maritime Continent and Piston Field Campaign. This is a continuation of a series of webinars for the CVP program that started several years ago. Today's webinars are being recorded and will be available from the CPO website under the Climate Variability and Predictability section. If you've missed any of our prior talks in past CVP webinars, such as the first two talks of this series, I encourage you to view them from our website. The first session has been recorded and posted, and the second session will be posted soon. The Years of Maritime Continent is an ongoing set of international field campaigns and modeling studies focused on the Maritime Continent region. YMC is led by the countries of Japan, Indonesia, and the US, in partnership with several others. Of particular interest to NOAA and the Climate Variability and Predictability Program is to improve understanding of processes that affect the propagation of interseasonal oscillations, such as MJO, in the Maritime Continent region and its broader regions. MJO is important to local weather and climate, as well as having teleconnections globally. However, the Maritime Continent region can sometimes act as a barrier to the propagation of MJO, and weather and climate models have a hard time reproducing this effect. In response to that need, the CVP program solicited for observation and modeling projects that investigate different processes that affect the MJO. Additionally, in collaboration with the Office of Naval Research, CVP supported several activities of the Piston campaign. This year's webinar series covers 16 projects that was funded by CVP. I look forward to hearing their results. So I'd like to thank Gabriella for organizing this series. She is the CVP student visitor, and for all the hard work that she's done putting this together. At this point, I'll turn it over to Gabriella. Anytime you're ready.
Thank you, Sandy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third of 10 webinar sessions on the topic of Years of Maritime Continent, which will feature 2 presentations per session and will run from September 10th, 2020 to March 11th, 2021. This series of presentations will share the latest results from these projects and will allow the PIs to discuss the importance of their work, outcomes, and lessons learned with the broader scientific community. We hope you will enjoy today's talks and ask plenty of questions. As you listen to these presentations, if you have a question you would like to ask the presenter, please raise your hand. Raise your hand is a feature which you can find on the control panel for GoToWebinar. At the end of the presentation, I will unmute those who have raised their hands so that they can ask their questions using their audio. If you have audio problems, I will ask you to type your question into the questions box, which can also be found on your control panel. Our first speaker today is Shui Chen from the University of Washington. Shui Chen is a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on understanding high-impact weather, such as hurricanes and the MJO, and improving their prediction. She studies air-sea interaction and precipitation in the tropics and coastal environments using observations and coupled atmosphere wave ocean models. Dr. Chen has led national and international research programs in both field campaigns and coupled atmosphere ocean modeling. Dr. Chen, thank you so much for joining us. And at this time, we will turn the controls over to you.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about our research on the topic of air-sea land interaction in MJO prediction and real physical system barrier over the maritime continent. This presentation will be 2 parts from our group. First part, I will be discussing the observations of the Dino Cycle in relationship to MJO. And second part will be the presentation by Ida Saravan on the cloud resolving coupled modeling study for this topic. So in this image, in the animation you are seeing right now is a tool that we will be using for our talk. And so basically is how we're tracking MJO in time space. So basically when you are looking at is animation of a tracking method, we track precipitation in time. So the way you're looking, the top image is the instantaneous rain rate. And then we accumulating them in 3-day accumulation, and then filter with a spatial filter, so making sure it's a large scale. So this method has been described in 2 publications by Brandon Kearns and myself, 2016 and 2020. We updated this whole data set into 20-year climatology. So the way the presentation will be using is that if you see this contour, that is the filtered contour, we track them in time. So basically the color in the second panel here is time. So you will see the spatial structure of these precipitation associated with MJO. The very important part, this is different than the traditional way of tracking MJO, is that actually tracking the actual entity that is not relying on the phase 1, phase 2, is a true physical quantity. It's not anomaly. And also have a meridional structure, which in the past, in the RMM type of tracking, we do not have that capability. So this meridional variation of MGO will be very important, especially if you want to looking at the global impact, downscale impact, because the heating center either north or south of the equator will have a very different downstream impact. So this do happen in lots of different ways. The corner, lower corner, I'm showing another event just like that, but it's very different than the one that we have. So MGO has very diverse characteristics individually. So that's how this tracking actually work. So current challenge for our NWP and climate model is really having difficulty to represent MGO convection in these true physical quantity in general. So I'll show you some examples of this is true. So with that in mind, so many of our results presented later in this presentation would be using, we call MGO LPT. So objective for this study overall, we would like to better understand and predict the MGO, especially its convective initiation, eastward propagation, and multi-scale variability. And in particular, today we'll be focused on quite a bit more on the air-sea land interaction over the maritime continent, especially on the Dino Cycle and MGO itself. The data I will be using here mostly first is this precipitation MGO tracking I just presented. And then the next quite a bit of results will be using 20-year geostationary satellite IR data that we track the cloud clusters. This also has been published many years before using data like hourly, and we'll keep track of a convective system, individual systems. This will be summarized in an upcoming manuscript. So along the way, I would like to show you some examples from the global model and climate models. For instance, ECMWF reforecast view, how they representing the MGO in that sort of 20-year reforecast, and also example from the MGO task force global model, and see how they representing these properties in general. Okay, with that in mind, so here is what overall summary of this MGO tracking. So over about 20 years, described detail in this paper, that we have about over 200 MGO events tracked as LPT. In this diagram, each of these blue dots representing the starting position of that LPT itself, and then the red cross means where it dissipated or ended. Then the brown lines indicating the tracks. So generally speaking, most MGO start equatorial region, and most of them over the Indian Ocean. And they propagate generally eastward and also some wind poleward. And this is 20 years data. Some of the northern hemisphere here one is more representing the summer season, and then the these part of the southern hemisphere or equatorial ones is more of the boreal winter season. So in this particular talk, I will be focused more mostly on the the boreal winter season. So if you break it down to our own focus today is the barrier effects of the maritime continent on MGO. Taking those MGOs start from the Indian Ocean, again, so this is the event we tracked. So the blue, now these events including the ones including only the ones initiated from Indian Ocean, the top panel, and the one made it through the maritime continent. That's the first group we call the MC crossing. That means cross the maritime continent. The second panel represents the one that start from Indian Ocean and terminate, never got through the maritime continent. And then the last group is the one that initiated somewhere east side of the maritime continent and mostly over the West Pacific. So two key number you can probably remember. One that is more than 40% of MGO initiated over the Indian Ocean, not making through the maritime continent. So that's usually we refer to this as a barrier effect. And then only less than 30% of MGO initiated over the West Pacific. So as you will see later on, model having difficulty representing these physical phenomena. I will get to that later part in the talk. So question for this study is what are the key factors affecting the barrier? So how does this natural barrier occur in observations? So we'd like to address that in this talk today. That question obviously is the size or strength of MGO itself matter? And what's unique about maritime continent? Obviously the land, the configuration of the land sea and air interaction with the sea and the land in this region matters. In particular, diurnal cycle of convection, which has been known for some time in the literature of Wells publication already documented that diurnal cycle can be affecting the MGO propagation. So this study is trying to put a little more quantitative information about how they do that. And still, these questions are somewhat open questions. So let's look at the diurnal cycle of cloud clusters. Here, the rest of several slides, I'll be showing you the cloud cluster tracked by cloud top temperature less than 208. And then we usually refer these as a mesoscale convective system. So each these little circles representing one particular system. And keep in mind that this is tracked over 20 years. There will be lots of it, right? So then the color in these maps, the smaller one representing the small mesoscale system or individual convective system that feed for the resolution is 4 kilometer resolution. And then the ones marked in magenta, that is mostly mesoscale convective systems. So the larger size, you can see the size of the circles are proportional to these convective systems. So in a non-MGO environment, means if the MGO is not present in here, so you can see the diurnal cycle that are very distinct. In the afternoon, most of the system is over land. And then in the morning, so for instance, most system is over water. So this property is fairly persistent, like afternoon, and versus in the morning. So this has also been described long ago, some of the process by Bob House in 1982, and we just made a lot more data and summarize that. But what's new is the next. So if we use our MGO LPT, we can look the same diurnal cycle only occurs when MGO is in place. So right away, you know there's a lot more convection over this time. So I'm going to run through this diurnal cycle again, just so you will see this property. Let's see if I can. Okay, so overnight, for instance, over 20 years is very distinct. We have a very low system in the morning that actually over land, mostly over water. And then if you look at the afternoon, during MGO, so I'm just going to have to stop in the right place. Okay, we'll start it again. Yeah, so in the late afternoon, it's still very dominant over land, but it's still a lot more over water as well. So overall, you just get more convection, but the diurnal properties seem to be similar in this particular way of demonstrate. So let's summarize that by accounting these numbers. So to the left side, these are non-MGO conditions, 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Then this is 6 a.m. in the morning. Just like I said, they have this nighttime, daytime difference. And you also can sort of transition yourself over to the right side. This is MGO conditions. 4 p.m., yes, still lots of convection over land, but at the same time, you also have a lot of them maintaining over water as well. But by the time 6 a.m. come along, land is seem to be much more empty, similar to what convective systems over the time when we have no MGO, but just lots more of this, right? So this is how I would kind of summarize what we're seeing here, is that during the daytime, we tend to have a convection over land. Nighttime, we seem to have a larger mesoscale organized system. So this land sea breeze circulation recycle itself, but then at the same time, the environment winds can be MGO or non-MGO that interacting with the system as a whole. So if you just look at what we said, you can see the size and duration. So basically over the seas, if you look at the frequency in terms of the size, overseas you have large MCSs, and also they last much longer, the lower panel representing the duration. And then if you compare that to the surprise period, you have no MGO versus an active MGO diurnal cycle, that definitely shows you, this is how you look, this is in time, and this is the how many clock clusters we have. So without MGO, you still have the nighttime maximum over water as you just saw, and then but you have a very dominant diurnal cycle for land, which is the brownish color here. Over land is a very large diurnal cycle, and then that changes when you get to the active phase. The diurnal cycle over land is get smaller, but then at the same time, the magnitude over water is much larger. So overall, if you see the cloud cluster, add them all together, the all is left. The surprise phase, we have less total numbers of mesoscale convective systems, but then at the same time, diurnal fraction is over sea and land. It's not quite drastically different, but if you go into the MGO conditions, now all of a sudden over ocean, you have 3 times of what happens over land. It's dominantly over ocean. And then that's pretty much lead us to conclude the MGO, this MGO part, it needs a very large and long-lasting nocturnal MCSs over water to succeed. So in that sense, model would have to represent this property in order to have successfully predicting MGO behavior in this region. So again, just to summarize one different ways that, if I take MGO active phase versus a suppressed phase, then I will find that both land and sea, I have a much larger system. So if you look at the area coverage, this place where, it's about close to the mesoscale system, that you just have a lot more organized, the large scale system overall, and you have much longer lasting system, lasting system there. So to summarize diurnal magnitude, so if you look at this normalized diurnal magnitude, so blue is the sea and the brown is over land. So if you look, the solid lines are the active phase and the dashed line is the surprise phase. So over land, over water, they're similar, even though you can see this over water part that they do last longer during the active phase. But in general, diurnal phase is the same. If you look at the diurnal magnitude over land over this 20 years data, clearly see in the surprise phase over land, the diurnal cycle magnitude is much larger. So in that sense, over land, that during the active phase, even though you still have convection, but the magnitude of diurnal amplitude is smaller. Now, back to our question we started off, is that what is making the difference between the one that passed, right? So with all that we just described, we know the MGO has to have a certain property in order to get cross. So then if we look back our data sets over the 20 years, as you can sort of see this crossing, non-crossing part, so you just focus on this top panel here. So we're looking at the sides because the MPO LPT, we can see how big of the precipitation size. So in general, you will see this black line represent the mean of these groups. And then the range of the size is pretty broad, right? So from small ones to the very large ones. Then if you look at the non-crossing group, now this mean from the other group is marked here. So it seemed to indicating the mean may be small, a little bit smaller, but overall there's broad distribution. That means you have some really large ones didn't get cross, and you have small ones that didn't get cross. So the range is broad, but maybe in the mean it's slightly smaller. All right, so can we distinguish the one, the crossing and the no crossing in the magnitude, amplitude in diurnal cycle? Remember the one I showed you before, just the overall, right? But now this is all very active one, except some crossed, some didn't. So this dashed line representing the one that did not cross, right? So the signal again is there, but it's much smaller. So it means that the broader distribution tells you that maybe the mean, the size is a little bigger for the one that crossed, and the land diurnal cycle may be a little weaker, but it's not as distinct as we separate active and convective phases. So, so that's pretty much summarize what our diurnal cycle properties from observations. So now I'm just quickly give you 2 examples of how model representing these properties. So this is barrier effect that plotted in this way. So we have a trim in the first column here, and the rest of groups are the lead time forecast for ECMWF reforecast over 20 years. So basically, the green is the maritime continent crossing case, and then there's blocking case, which is the brown, and then the one that in the West Pacific. So then if you look at this over what we just discussed, then the model in general is under predicting the one over Indian Ocean. So in the sense that they just much a smaller group compared to, and the model seemed to overwhelmingly like West Pacific, no matter what lead time you have. And also model tend to be a little more, have more non-crossing case than observations, model exaggerating that part. And then if you look at the global climate model from the MGO global model and some of the climate model and from MGO task force, so then obviously a lot more blue here. That means a lot of model just really producing lots of event over West Pacific. And some model have a really difficult time to produce anything that over the maritime continent or something. So you can see this group is very small, and the model having hard time to bring them across over the maritime continent. So there's a lot of different reasons for that. I don't have time to go through, but when we did look through some of the results, in the one overwhelming properties, the model tend to perform West Pacific and also very, very bad diurnal cycle. So one last thing I'd like to transition to the next part of the talk is that the MGO propagating before toward the maritime continent also matters, because a lot of times you have Indian Ocean initiation events, but then at the same time, you may not actually propagate all the way to the maritime continent. So if you look at that, so you can sort of see this as propagation range and the speed. So TRIM is over here, and the ECMWF I just showed you is actually pretty close in terms of propagation speed. But then at the same time, the global climate model usually is way, way too slow. Except the encouraging news of the field couple model, which I marked in this region, is actually better, which also true too in this diagram. So in general, the coupled atmosphere ocean model seem to do better in general propagation and the structure itself. Yeah, I just stated what I had to say. And then we want to fully understand this process. What is about this maritime physical process that affecting the MGO propagation? Like I said, observational wise, we seem to have indication there is a barrier effect, and the diurnal cycles and the size of MGO seem to play a role, but it's very difficult to really parse the physical process in this observational study. So this next thing that IDA is going to be using this model to document a little more in terms of what we have studied. So the last thing I want to remind you that the early studies we had, again, showing the coupled model versus uncoupled model using this setup. So the first thing, the top level, is the MGO propagation and surface wind and SST. This is top ones observed. If you have uncoupled model, you have a problem of propagating MGO. MGO is very stationary in this uncoupled model with constant SST. And then with the coupling, this last two, we added a coupling. Now we produce upper ocean cooling, and all of a sudden MGO started propagating. So this cooling, upper ocean cooling, provided a part that actually stop overwhelming convection to stay there, not wanting to move. So that certainly helped in terms of eastward propagation, even though there's other atmosphere dynamic process driving the eastward propagation, but without coupling to the upper ocean, we're having difficulty to do that. So this is the way we will be using this. IDA will present this case to using observed MGO, using how observed LPT representing MGO eastward propagation. Uncoupled model produced a gigantic stationary precipitation feature over the here canal propagating. So then coupled to ocean, and the last one, I don't have time to go through the detail, but it's written in this two papers by us, and it describe how we improve air sea fluxes actually help the propagation as well. So to summarize and conclusions, summary is simple. We actually have this LPT that provide a very robust and direct measurements of MGO precipitation that capture zonal and meridional structures. And we also documented the seasonal and internal variability. And the barrier effect on MGO eastward propagation is most pronounced in the winter season, which I didn't have time to show. Model tend to over-exaggerate MGO the maritime continent barrier effects, largely due to model like to produce landlocked convection, wrong diurnal cycle, and favor West Pacific than the Indian Ocean. And in conclusion, really 2 points. One, that the multi-scale air sea interaction seem to play an important role over Indian Ocean, that upper ocean cooling seemed to help the eastward propagation. And then the MGO needs a very large, long-lasting MCSs overnight to really develop over sea in order to pass the maritime continent. So with that, I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. At this time, if anyone has any questions, please use the raise your hand option in your control panel. I will give you permission to unmute yourself, and from there you will have to unmute yourself on your panel as well. It looks like we already have a question in the chat box that says, do you think during the suppressed MJO there is more water vapor recycling over the maritime continent? This is a question from Arturo Quintanar.
If I understand your question, you're talking about during the surprise phase when the MGO is not there. And then your question is whether you have more evaporation from the ocean land that into the atmosphere cycling. Is that your question? I guess if it is the question, then I can't really answer that question right now because we have not looked at water vapor properties in that concept. So right now we have over 20 events. We have lots of surprise phase. We could potentially using the same method of looking at surprise phase in terms of water vapor difference and things. But for now, we have not looked at the 20 years composite in that large scale dynamics part of the including winds.
We have another question from Tim Lee. I'm going to give you permission to unmute yourself.
Sui, thank you for very interesting talk. You show very nicely how MGO influenced the Dino Cycle. But my question is, how does changing of the Dino Cycle feed back to the propagation of the MGO? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, excellent question, and that's exactly Aida's going to address, and she's going to show the next part of the talk, addressing this how Dino Cycle can influence MGO over the maritime continent. So stay tuned. You'll find the answer from her. It's half influence and it's very interesting results. I'll just give you a lead into that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you have more questions, you can always email us. And then also we have the this work being summarized in a number of publications. We'll be happy to send you some of the work we're in process of writing manuscripts and some being submitted. So communication offline, be welcome.
Shui, there's another question in the box, and it says, in ECMWF IFS, are the West Pacific MJO events more predictable than those starting from the Indian Ocean? And it's being asked by Jaime Kim.
Okay, excellent question. I didn't have time to show this. One thing that I did show is the ECMWF seemed to produce more West Pacific case than Indian Ocean in general. And then at the same time, MGO prediction climatology over that 20-year reforecast is excellent. In fact, regardless of lead time, the ECMWF seemed to produce good population, except they just moved over to West Pacific more than in the ocean. On the other hand, MGO statistics good, but the ECMWF model have difficulty to predict exactly where it occurs and the time. So if I look the details in terms of where that event occurs and the timing, so often the Indian Ocean event is much less being predicted. Often model misplace them over the east part of the maritime continent or West Pacific. So there's misplacement, and at the same time, the timing of when it occur, they're equally bad in terms of timing, which means off by several days or sometimes a week or two. But if you just look at climatology, model produce number of event over 20 years, over 200 events, model does pretty well. So it's not predictable in time and space if you're looking at the weather forecast. But if you look at climate, ECMWF model is very good climate, sort of produce a good MGO climate. But the climate model is a completely different story. They can't seem to produce either the climate or the real events. And that's a still difficult one.
Thank you so much. It looks like that's all the time we have for questions. Up next is a presentation by Ida Savarin from the University of Washington. Ida is a PhD candidate in atmospheric sciences. She received a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and a Master of Science in Meteorology and Physical Oceanography from the University of Miami. Ida's PhD research focuses on air-sea interaction in the MJO and the diurnal cycle of convection over the maritime continent. She was awarded the NASA Earth Science Fellowship and is the student representative on the AGU Atmospheric Science Committee. Ida, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, we will turn the controls over to you.
Well, I would like to thank Shui for very nicely introducing what I'm going to talk about during her talk. So we're focusing on the role of air-sea land interaction with the MJO over the maritime continent, specifically focusing on cloud resolving coupled modeling to address how the diurnal cycle feeds back onto the MJO. And we have two overarching questions that I want to address quickly today. So the first one is, how does the presence of maritime continent and maritime continent topography, so the mountains that are there, affect MJO's eastward propagation? And the second one is, how does the air-sea land interaction over the maritime continent affect the diurnal cycle of convection, and through that, the MJO propagation? So kind of the return question. So Shui already introduced our coupled model configuration. We have a wharf in the atmosphere with 45 vertical levels and an inner nest with a convection permitting domain. So that's a 4-kilometer resolution. And the ocean is a dynamically evolving HICOM with 41 vertical layers and about 9-kilometer horizontal resolution at the equator. And I'll be talking, so here on the right, the figure is showing our domain, our model domain with the 3 different nested domains. The colors are showing SST and the topography, so you can clearly see the mountainous region over the maritime continent. So I'll be showing results of 3 experiments. The first one is the control, which is our best model run for the MJO case that we're simulating, which is a November 2011 case that was observed during Dynamo. So that one has realistic topography, it has dynamically evolving SST, it's got everything. We compare that to the flat experiment, where all of a sudden we flattened maritime continent topography. We've changed land use to forest, so now it's all 10-meter land, but there's no mountains, so there's no mountain or elevated heating, and there's no physical barrier to propagation. And the third experiment we have is our water experiment, where maritime topography is replaced by a 50-meter deep ocean. The SST initially is interpolated from coastlines and smooths, and then evolves dynamically through the ocean model as time progresses. So this is what the SST field looks like. You can kind of see a little bit of smoothing right here where Borneo used to be. So that's the smoothing part. But over water, the initial condition remains the same. Okay, and as Shui mentioned, we use LPT tracking for MJO identification. It's uniquely great because we can use it in regional models. For a lot of traditional MJO tracking or MJO identification, you'll need global fields for a long time. We only have a 15-day simulation over a smaller region, so this is perfect. Plus, it gives us metrics like MJO propagation speed, duration, area, that we can then compare to observations to each other and see how model simulations are different. All right, so let's start with comparing first how our control run does compare to observations. So these are 5 degrees south to north average Hofmahler diagrams. Time is going up here. And on the left, we have trim observations for this MJO event. And then on the right-hand side, we have our control simulation. And in general, our control simulation actually does a pretty good job simulating, even though we have too much precipitation. And because of that, we use a slightly higher threshold for LPT tracking than we do than the study for the 20-year climatology does. But the results for trim do not change. It's just the control follows precipitation a little bit better at higher thresholds. So when we compare our control simulation to our other two simulations, now we have control on the left, flat, and then water on the right-hand side, we can observe a few different things. So the first one is in the first few days of the simulation, when the MJO is over the Indian Ocean, the simulations are actually very similar to each other. There are small differences, especially the water has a little bit more precipitation the closer it gets to the maritime continent region, but in general, they're very similar. The differences start appearing when the MJO is over the maritime continent. Specifically, what we see is that there's less organized convection in the flat experiment. So right here, you can kind of see things, there's less in general precipitation. And then there's absolutely no weakening of precipitation in the water experiment, as was expected. The MJO just keeps propagating through. There's also differences later on in the simulation. So the fate of the MJO is a little bit different between the three, well, especially in the water. But we're mostly going to be focusing on this active MJO period for this talk. So comparing LPT tracks for this event, we have trim on top and our control simulation on the bottom. In the observed simulation, you can see a very smooth eastward propagation. There is some reduction in size over the maritime continent. So right here, the observed MJO does it becomes smaller, and that is also observed over in our control simulation, but it's more drastic in our control simulation. So the LPT starts too big over the Indian Ocean. It does propagate smoothly until it hits maritime continent. This is where it kind of stalls for a little bit, and then it jumps over and forms newer convection to the east. So there is a little bit of a lag, and so there is some of that barrier or something that is blocking the smooth eastward propagation. When we compare this to our flat and water runs, now here on the left, there are again quite a few differences, specifically when we focus on this maritime continent region. When we look at the flat experiment, remember there's now no mountain, so there's no physical barrier to the flow. All of a sudden, and actually quite unexpectedly, the MJO over this region becomes more disjointed. You can kind of see it almost dying. That's a sign of that. In the Hofmahler diagram, we saw that much less precipitation in this region. And then all of a sudden it jumps. There's a very abrupt shift to the precipitation in the Western Pacific. And in our water experiment, as was mostly expected, we get a very smooth propagation through the MC, no weakening, nothing concatenating, everything stays big and happily moves to the east. So from this portion, we can see that removing the maritime continent topography seems to weaken the MJO, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Removing land altogether makes it stronger, but we want to investigate a little bit further to see how the local air-sea land interaction processes are affecting this. And specifically, we focus on the diurnal cycle because it is very persistent and is very, very strong over the maritime continent. So to focus on the maritime continent, we do a special type of analysis in a framework that is relative to distance from coastline. So we use very high resolution topography data set to identify land and water areas, and then each point gets assigned a distance to its nearest coastline. So browns that are shaded are distances that are over land, and you can see as you go farther inland, they become farther away from the coast, and then the blue distances are over water. And when we look at the point distribution, we'll chop things off at about 200 kilometers from the coast, because beyond that, there's actually very few points over the maritime continent. And as you would expect, there's the most points since we have islands that are just offshore. And then we can use this to bin any field according to its distance from coastline. So what that looks like, for example, is we start with trim precipitation. We have a morning 6 a.m. on the top composite and a 9 p.m. local time on the bottom. And you can see, as you would expect, local maximum over water at 6 in the morning. So that would be the land breeze effect. And then at 9 p.m., you get precipitation over land and over mountainous regions. So that would be the sea breeze, and almost nothing over water, especially in the Western maritime continent. So we can then use this distance from coastline to create a Hofmüller type diagram. So now on the left, we have land, so you're going inland, and on the right, we have ocean. And these two times are just a single line in this Hofmüller diagram. And what you can see is this intense precipitation peak that forms on shore and then propagates west. This is repeated twice, so it propagates westward inland. And then we have this water peak in the early morning that propagates offshore. And we can further summarize this in a line plot. So now each color is basically one chunk of this Hofmüller diagram. Again, we have land on the left, ocean on the right, and we can see how you can see the changes. So this seesaw mechanism or the seesaw variability of the diurnal cycle of precipitation, where we have an afternoon precipitation over land, this maximized, and then reduced or propagates inland is reduced in early morning, there's a minimum, and the opposite is happening on the coastline or just over water, just offshore. So we can use this to look at how our model reproduces the diurnal cycle and what that looks like and how they're different. So first, comparing TRIM observations just over the 15 days of our model simulation to the control, we can see right away that our precipitation over land is much exaggerated compared to TRIM. So there is a caveat there, sorry, in that TRIM only has 1/4 degree resolution, and so we're not entirely sure how good it resolves precipitation over land, especially if that land is mountainous. It is definitely more reliable over water, but our model, regardless, has a very high bias over land. But the timing of the diurnal cycle is very good, and when we compare it to, say, ERA 5 and MERA 2 and other types of reanalysis, we do much better on average than they do. So what happens when we remove land? What happens to the diurnal cycle? So on top, we have control and then flat water lower down. So you can see going from control to flat, so removing mountains, we see the reduced amplitude of the diurnal cycle. So that is kind of expected because the mountains force uplift and that will, cause precipitation. But this amplitude stays very, very consistent. So the systems are just building up on the coastline and then they're smoothly propagating inland. Whereas in the control simulation, there was this growth with inland propagation. And the nighttime precipitation peak actually spreads out a little bit farther offshore than it does in the control simulation. So you can see this peak goes off a little bit. And then in the water simulation, just for completeness, we don't see any seesaw pattern because we don't have any land anymore. So that was a good balance check to make sure we're doing the right thing. And we do see that there's a maximum precipitation everywhere in the early morning, which is what we would expect over open ocean. So that's good. And then just comparing what these diurnal cycles look like with different MJO tracks, we can see that actually this very consistent diurnal cycle over land and water in the flat experiment is more disruptive to MJO propagation than is this very high amplitude diurnal cycle in the control simulation. But obviously, when we don't have any seesaw cycling, so we just have the water, the MJO is not disrupted at all. So we want to see what it is about this flat experiment or the difference between the flat and the control experiments that is making this MJO not so happy to propagate or more likely to dissipate over this region. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus only on the days the MJO is active over the maritime continent. So that's the 5 days in the middle of our simulation. And we're only going to focus on a small region over the Western Borneo, just because it's a little bit more intuitive to interpret the results. And just for this part, I will be flipping the direction of all the distance from coastline. So now we have land on the right side, ocean on the left side. Hopefully it's not too confusing, but the reason is that we can see that pretty much everything that's moving inland is going eastward. Everything that's moving offshore is going westward, so that will be a little bit easier to interpret. Okay, so first we look at mean winds and what happens from the pre-MJO to MJO phase. So we have the mean winds from control, flat, and water experiments before the MJO. We have easterly winds as you would expect, nothing interesting going on there. But as you get into the MJO, we start building westerlies. So right here, this is the control simulation. We start seeing westerly flow associated with the MJO. It's a little bit stronger in the flat experiment, and then in the water, it just kind of bludgeons through. There's nothing stopping it at all. But from now, we're only focusing, as I mentioned before, on the differences in the diurnal cycle that are induced by removing topography. So differences between the control and flat experiments. So what we're looking for here is these are Hofmahler diagrams, except now they're not with longitude, they're with distance from coastline in the control and flat runs. And you can kind of see very quickly that they're quite different in that in the flat experiment, the diurnal cycle is much more regular than in control. So it just happens every day. It goes offshore, onshore, offshore, onshore. Whereas in the control experiment, we have these days where sometimes it's really strong, sometimes it's weak, sometimes there's nothing at all. So it's more variable. And if we look at the line composite, we can, for the 5 days, we can see that the propagation offshore is much smoother in the flat experiment. And in this case, offshore means westward. So this is counter to the MJO flow, right? MJO wants to go from west to east, but these guys are going from east to west. And we want to see how that changes or how the circulation changes. So the next set of figures I'm going to show is the same distance from coastline composite, except now we have height on the y-axis. So we have a distance from coastline on the x-axis. So it's a vertical cross section. And the colors are showing onshore, offshore wind anomalies. So the blue colors mean offshore flow, which in this case would be from easterly. And the red colors are showing onshore flow, which is westerly in this case. And the left side is showing the control experiment, the right side is for flat. And these black outline contours outline clouds, so hydrometeors from the model. And so this animation or this image is from 6 a.m., so 6 in the morning. And 6 in the morning, we would expect a land breeze, so that's what you're seeing in both simulations, and a return flow aloft. And you can kind of see from here that the land breeze is a little bit weaker in the model, in the flat experiment than is in the control. So there's no mountains amplifying the flow, but it's still very much there. And here's an animation if you want to look through it through the course of a day. So it's hourly for 24 hours. And you can see, so right now it's a sea breeze transitioning to a land breeze, so offshore flow, and then again transitioning to a sea breeze. But since it's kind of hard to see anything from this, I'm going to show two images or two specific times. There's 6 in the morning on top, 3 in the afternoon on the bottom, contrasting the two times and contrasting the two model experiments. And one thing to keep in mind is that the interaction between the mean flow and the diurnal cycle are slightly different because the flat experiment has slightly stronger mean westerlies. So that will be eroding the offshore flow a little bit in the flat run. But it's actually interesting that these land sea breezes, they're not that much weaker. They still happen every day. They happen very repetitively. And this return flow that is easterly, so it's countering the large-scale MJO flow, is actually stronger in our flat experiment. So the MJO wants to go eastward, but every day, repeatedly, you get these anomalous easterlies that are kind of poking at it and saying, no, we want to go the other way. And you can see that the precipitation actually follows these winds more than it does the MJO flow. So there's no large-scale MJO eastward propagation when we looked at the Hofmahler diagram. So just to summarize what I've talked about, the first point we have is that the presence of the maritime continent definitely affects MJO propagation, organization of precipitation, and circulation. We saw that when you remove mountains, the MJO propagation actually weakens, but when terrain is entirely removed, the MJO becomes stronger and propagates much more smoothly. And the second one is we saw that whenever you have a regular and persistent diurnal cycle, so the thing that repeats every day regardless of what's happening on the large scale, as what happens in our flat experiment, seems to be more detrimental to MJO propagation than maybe a stronger dynamical signal that does not happen as often. So for example, in our control run, we saw quite a few days that didn't really have that much precipitation propagating offshore. So the precipitation diurnal cycle is a little bit more messy. And then to conclude that, we see that air-sea land interaction is an important part of MJO propagation of the maritime continent. And therefore, it must be something that is addressed in order for modeling to become better. So remember, this MJO propagation over the maritime continent is an issue for models. And so that's definitely something that we should focus on and spend more time looking at. So I will leave it here if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much, Ida. Again, if anyone has a question, either use the questions box or raise your hand. It looks like we already have a question from Arturo Quintanar. I'm going to go ahead and give you permission to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for your very nice talk, Ida. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you considered running WRF with a mixed layer. I mean, I'm pointing to the question of how the ocean fluxes are doing something to the simulation too, because you have like I don't know how long did you integrate the WRF? Maybe more than a month or so?
No, we have a 15-day simulation.
Right.
So at high resolution, it becomes very expensive to run for longer times.
Yeah. So, but in that sense, maybe the ocean is too steady. I mean, probably it's not changing very much. So I wonder if an SST. I mean, if you run WRF with prescribed SSTs, would you get the same thing?
I cannot say. I can say that we have a dynamical ocean model that evolves so it evolves with WRF. So every time the atmosphere does something, the ocean will respond, and vice versa. There have been studies that prescribed SSTs and generally their MJO propagation improved, but our MJO over the course of 15 days was pretty good, and we never, since we have a fully coupled ocean model, we never really played with putting in anything simpler. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and that's good. Thank you very much, Ida.
It looks like we have another question from Tim Lee.
Okay, it seems that from the Hoff-Moller diagram of the precipitation, it looks like difference between those three is not that obvious. Okay, that's a small difference, yeah, I would see. Okay, so therefore, the conclusion maybe you need to run more cases. This is just one special case. But just for this case, let me ask you a question. Basically, you show some difference in terms of diurnal cycle, but on the meantime, because the change of the either flat or water, you also change the mean state. So how do you know the change is due to diurnal cycle?
So when I show the diurnal cycle composite, so as I mentioned in the flat experiment, the mean flow, the westerly mean flow is actually stronger. So if the MJO was, if you assign the MJO strength based on its mean flow, the flat experiment will have a stronger case. But the precipitation in the flat experiment starts dissipating more over the maritime continent. So the stronger mean flow doesn't actually necessarily translate, or the stronger westerly flow doesn't actually translate into a stronger MJO in terms of precipitation. And when I'm making these diurnal composites for the vertical cross sections, for the winds, the mean is taken out. So these are anomalies, as I mentioned. So the mean flow should not really, at least in these composites, should not play a big role in terms of what is shown, right? But again, these are anomalies, and you do see a slightly weaker land breeze in the flat experiment because it is countering the westerly mean flow. But at the same time, the flat experiment still does produce a large region of easterlies or easterly wind anomalies that are pushing against the mean flow, and they're pushing against the mean flow more in the flat experiment. So when we remove mountains. And that part, and the fact that this happens much more frequently, so it happens every day, where in the control run it happens less frequently, seems to be what is killing or dissipating that organized precipitation more successfully than in the control.
Ajada, what I mean, the mean state is not just only in the wind, but also other part of mean state, like moisture and precipitation. So
in terms of precipitation, the mean states are fairly similar. In terms of moisture, there are slight differences. There is a little bit more moisture in the flat experiment because we don't have the dry air up on the mountaintops. And in terms of temperature, like land temperature, we don't see large differences between the two simulations.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like that's all the time we have for questions. We would like to thank you all for joining us for this set of presentations in our series on Years of Maritime Continent. I would like to thank today's presenters again for taking the time to share their work with us. The recording of today's webinar will be available within the next week on our website, cpo.noaa.gov/cbp. We hope you will join us for the next webinar on October 22nd. Thank you so much.